Hey, this is James Glass, and I'm here tonight working on our tiny home, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how water heaters like this are really a bomb, and there's only one thing that keeps it from blowing up and throwing shrapnel and hot water over you and your family, and that is the T&P valve. And these things have to be in good working order to make sure that your water heater is safe, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that right now. So T&P valves, T&P stands for temperature and pressure. And what happens is in a tanked water heater like this, this happens to be a 240 volt one. Most of them are. There are some 120s. But behind this plate there is a heating element that inserts in the water. And behind that plate there's a heating element that inserts in the water. And it has a thermostat on it. I have set these thermostats at 125 degrees, which is a pretty typical temperature. You can turn them a little bit lower if you want water that's not as hot and to conserve a little bit of energy. So the way this thing works is in the event that the temperature rises above 210 degrees, which is essentially almost boiling point, or 150 psi, because whenever something is heated, it expands, this thing opens up. And specifically what happens is the spring inside of this is overcome, and there's a valve in here that opens up. This sensor goes down into the water and checks for those two conditions, 150 psi or 210 degrees. So, the whole point of this thing, when it's functioning correctly, it will blow the pressure off the tank, because if this didn't exist, if this was plugged or bypassed or didn't have it for some reason, this tank would literally have to blow up. That pressure has to go somewhere, and eventually, these tanks, it will eventually just literally blow up. And it happens with boilers too. And 10, 15 years ago, there was a boiler at a school here in Southwest Virginia. Actually, no one was hurt, but it blew through the roof. So, and you've probably seen the Mythbusters episodes where they've basically bypassed this. And if you haven't, go check it out. It's pretty cool. Where they actually, turn this into a missile. It's pretty cool. So, how can you make sure you're safe? Well, if this thing is doing its job, you can always, if you lift this lever up, water will come out. If this thing is doing its job, you won't see any water coming out of this out of the safety pipe. So these things have a pipe connected to them, because if this was to open up while you were standing in front of it, you would be scalded. Your skin would melt. So it's critical that you put a pipe on that diverts the water away. Now I'm going to put my pipe. Ultimately, this is just a temporary setup. I was having a problem with my T&P valve, so I've got this pipe diverted down to this plate because I was getting some water leakage, and I investigated and found out why. It was a faulty T&P valve, and so I have installed the new T&P valve, and I'm looking for water leakage. So far there is none. So, and the reason it failed was, this is only an 8-year-old water heater, but this dude was super crusty. It was on municipal water, but after it came out of service, it sat in the guy's basement for a while. And after going out of the environment of immersed in water, it sat in just the regular environment of his basement, and it got really corroded. And the valve, the cap that's on here, the little valve, was sticking. And I suspected it was going to be a dud, because when I was first filling this, I could hear air leaking out of this guy right away. I rocked it back and forth, and it did seal it. But it was no surprise that after it heated water, particularly after I took a hot shower, and then the elements came on and heated it up, it was actually blowing off, at very, very low pressures. I put a gauge on there to check it. I've never had anything above 55 psi, and so this thing was opening up in the 60 to 70 psi range, so that's why it was failing. The water coming out was 125. It's right where the thermostat's at, so I knew the temperature was right, and I knew the pressure was right. And I knew this was already suspect from the moment I installed it, so it was no surprise that I had to put a T&P valve in. So make sure these things work. In this case, it would have just been nuisance tripping. This thing, was actually opening up too soon, and so. But if it is nuisance leaking, you do not want to just plug it. You do not want to be like, oh, well, water's coming out of this, I'm just going to put a plug in there. You will turn your water heater into a bomb. So these things are only $16, and they're not expensive, and your life is worth it. Now, a couple of add-on notes. That's all the safety information. We're 5 minutes into this video. If you want to hear about open and closed water systems, keep listening. So, this does not apply to tankless units. Expansion tanks are not needed on tankless units. But on tanked water heaters in a closed system, you need an expansion tank. You'll notice that there is not an expansion tank on this system. Those are those little cylindrical objects. There's actually a diaphragm in there, and water fills up part of it and compresses the diaphragm, and then it actually has air is easily compressible and water is not. So if there's excess pressure in a closed system, and I'll explain why in just a second, that diaphragm will actually take those pressure differences and not cause nuisance tripping on your TMP valve. First, let's talk about an open system. So an open system means that this system is open to municipal water. Now, this is temporary. Where I live, you cannot have open systems. So for the next couple of months, I have an open system. But when I properly plumb this house, it will meet, more than meet minimum building code, and this will become a closed system. But I'll have a tankless unit, so that, again, doesn't apply. This only applies to tanked water heaters. An open system means that, see that PEX line coming in? That literally comes in from the street. And it's 3/4 inch line, and I just happen to have some 1/2 inch and a reducer, so that's what I threw in here. But that comes up, no check valve, no one-way valve, no backflow prevention device. By the way, the backflow valves are way better than the check valves, and check valves are under $20, and the backflow valves are 40 to 60. Just get the 40 to 60 backflow valve. It's a far superior way to make sure the water only goes one way. So in this case, when this water heater heats up and expands, and the pressure in here, like when you've taken a hot shower, if you've done laundry in hot, I do all my laundry in cold, but if you happen to do laundry in hot or something, and this sucker is cooking, and you got those two elements cooking, the pressure in here does get up pretty high, and it does get up above line pressure, and so it doesn't get above 90. I mean, if it gets above 90, you got an issue, but you can see it in the 60 to 80 range, and so what happens is that extra pressure that's being caused by the heated water has to go somewhere. And in an open system, which is what they all were until, say, 20, 25 years ago, when backflow devices were required, in an open system, the pressure would simply go back out the water line and into the municipal system. It would push back in. And that allowed enough for expansion, and then you'd have no leakage out of your TMP valve. But with the advent of closed systems, and they're really important, it is kind of nice not to be pushing your domestic water back into the city supply. And also, if you've got a well, it's a whole different thing. I'm not even going to get into wells in this video. But with a closed system, you've got a check valve or a backflow limiter that does not allow the water to go back into the municipal system. There's no place for the extra pressure to go, and sometimes you get nuisance tripping. So you'll see on those devices, there'll be a T in the line here that goes over to one of those little expansion tanks. And that way, when the water heater increases the pressure in the system during reheat, especially, but even after, it's always going to be increased pressure, but it's going to be really increased pressure after you've drained this sucker and it's working hard to reheat. It goes into that tank, and that tank absorbs that extra pressure. So there you go. If you have a closed system, which means that you have a backflow prevention device that does not allow expansion back into the municipal water supply, you have to have a tank. If you have an open system, you don't need a tank. So there you go. Extra 4 minutes of bonus on open versus closed domestic water systems. But the big thing here is don't make your water heater a bomb. Make sure your TMP valve is working. Literally, this is not hyperbole. Your life does depend on it. You do not want this thing to blow up. Hey, thanks for watching.